Hey everybody, this is Jim Grzanzio from the Oracle Groundbreakers team, and we're back here for some more interviews for the Oracle Groundbreakers Yatra that's taking place over the next couple of weeks. And I'm here with Melliyal Annamalai. Melli is a PhD in computer science at Oracle, and we're going to talk about big data tonight. And Melli, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Jim. And I must say, you pronounce my name beautifully. Not everyone gets it right. So thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
Huge compliment, and I'm very happy you said that because I'm horrible with these names sometimes. If it's not John, Paul, George, or Ringo, I have a problem with it. Okay, so we've never met before, and so I'm going to explore this along with everybody else that's listening. I reached out to you specifically because I'm reaching out to speakers for the Oracle Groundbreakers Yatra that's taking place now, and there was it's like 70 speakers on this conference. It's massive, but I specifically reached out to people that I haven't actually spoken to before, so I can meet new friends and also learn new things. I learn from these conversations, so I'm really excited to have a quick conversation with you. So let's start off with what you're going to be talking about at the conference. I see here it's query Kafka streams with Oracle SQL. So now, if I've never queried Kafka streams with Oracle SQL, what am I going to learn? What's it all about?
So let's start with Apache Kafka, which is infrastructure for managing streaming data. It manages streaming data in a fault-tolerant, reliable way, scalable way. So what it means is if you have data streaming in at high speed from multiple sources, let's say medical device or something, or maybe temperature monitored, that are just streaming in record, let's say they're saying 2 readings every second, and they're streaming in data continuously. Apache Kafka gives you a good infrastructure to manage that data, streaming data. Yeah. So if you're a database developer, you typically write all your applications on your database, and you're used to doing that with Oracle SQL, but you need to now start working with this data that's streaming in, because that's a data source that you need to include in your applications. What I'm going to talk about is how you can do that with SQL, how you can live in SQL land, use SQL tools that you're familiar with, but reach out to this external data source that is streaming data coming in at a very high speed.
Okay, so this is primarily for developers then?
Yeah, database developers.
Database developers, okay.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of streaming, you mentioned like the medical field. This has to be apt, especially for today, considering that there's a lot of telemedicine actually happening today now, given the situation with COVID, and just in general, that is an emerging field even under normal circumstances.
Right.
What's the difference between, if you have an application locally, you still have to stream it out over a network, right? Mm-hmm. So how do the network, you have the local situation, but what about the network, because you don't really have control over that, right?
Right. So when you're developing an application using streaming data, that is definitely one thing to keep in mind. What network bandwidth do you have at your disposal? So if you're really monitoring something like medical devices, and I just want to mention an example of a friend who had surgery recently, and the technology is just amazing. They're going to be monitoring some of her brain activity using some electrodes, and all she has to do is wave her hand, and data gets uploaded somewhere and streamed out for doctors to see. That's absolutely fantastic. But when you're building such an application, you do have to keep in mind the network bandwidth requirements that you have and ensure that you have enough to manage this data, because the data tends to be very high volume and coming in at very high speed, like multiple readings per second. But the interesting characteristic of this data also is that you might not care about all of the data. You might only care about few of the data items, or maybe you only care about what happened in the last 5 seconds. And this might or might not be the case for medical devices. I'm generally talking about streaming data. It might only be, you might be okay with dropping a few records, or you might be okay with saying, I only want the last 5 seconds, or I want to go back in time 6 minutes and 41 seconds and go and look at that particular data item. I'm not interested in anything else. So in that sense, the data query requirements could be a little different from a classic business application in the database where every record is important, otherwise it would not be persisted. The thing about streaming data is you don't have to persist everything. Kafka itself has the infrastructure for aging out data. So you can set a parameter to say maybe every 7 days I'm going to age the data out. Because it's old data, it's not interesting to me any longer. So we give, as part of our SQL access to Kafka feature, we give developers tools to decide which Kafka records they want to persist in the database. So the rest of it is not useful and they can discard it. They can query it, look at it, analyze it, and then discard it and select only the records that they need and persist that to the database.
Interesting. The reason I asked the question about the network is I became very aware of streaming issues when we go to conference and we stream interviews live, and but that's for sort of, things aren't that important. I mean, when you're streaming for a medical situation, I would imagine that, is obviously a non-trivial situation. So, I mean, we would, obviously we could, scale down the quality of our stream, it comes out, lower quality, but you might not want that if you need the precision for like an industrial use, right?
Very true. Very true. If you want that precision, then as you said, you'd have to ensure that you have reliable network bandwidth, like we would have within an organization, for example, right? A network that is fast and doesn't fail much. Like with the company I work for, Oracle, we have good, strong network. So yeah, something like that would have to be.
Whenever I go to a conference and they want me to stream, I always ask for 100 megabits per second up, and they said, "Oh, that's a little expensive."
Right.
Well, sometimes they give me 1 or 2 megabits, and I said, I really can't make a phone call with that. I mean, I'm going to have to really knock my stream down really, really low. 1 or 2 megabits per second. But I mean, if you're streaming for like a surgical situation and stuff, I mean, what are some of the specs you must really need some very because you need the reliability in that situation, right?
Right. So the metrics we hear is we hear things like 200,000 messages a day, or we'll hear things like, I think I've heard as much as 4 million messages a day, or 200K messages an hour. And all these are there's a whole range about
Right.
what people want to manage with Kafka. So in terms of the infrastructure, that's where Apache Kafka does really well, actually. It does very well to scale. So they have a distributed architecture where you have multiple nodes, and you have the brokers which help determine how this cluster manages all of this data. So it scales pretty seamlessly. When there's a higher volume coming in, more nodes are doing the work and so on. So the Apache cluster does a good job. So our challenge when we were designing this feature of enabling Oracle SQL to access Kafka, our challenge was to ensure that we are able to read at the speeds required by the developer and not lose any of the records. So for critical applications, it is important not to lose any of the Kafka records.
Right.
I was saying earlier that some applications, maybe it's okay to lose some records, but as you're pointing out, in a medical situation, you don't want to lose any records. So it's very important to know how far you've read in the Kafka stream, because messages are constantly coming in. It's important to know how far you've read and where we need to start reading again. So we take the concept of a Kafka offset, which keeps track of where you're reading in the stream. And we take that Kafka offset and store that under database transaction control so that we can be sure to guarantee that records are not lost. You're reading records. So
Interesting.
these are some of the things we have put in place to ensure that data is kind of
Yeah.
not lost.
Interesting. I've never been involved with that level of scalability, obviously, but I have, run across the issue in this, lower level here, but just streaming your video over the internet. So this talk and this whole subject that you're talking about now, in terms of, with Oracle SQL, querying Kafka streams, is this something new to developers? Is this particular, or is it fairly well known? What you're going to talk about?
It's a new product from our perspective. People have been trying to do this for a while. They've been trying to kind of connect the Kafka world with the database world, and they're kind of two different worlds. This one is data that's constantly streaming, and this is data that's more like at rest, the database. So people have been trying to integrate these two worlds. So we released this product for the first time late December last year. And we've since had a 1.1 version, and we're working on 2.0 and so on. So it is new to developers, but we're seeing a lot of interest. So I'm hopeful that developers will find it easy to integrate the two worlds when they use this.
Right. Cool. Okay. Great. Is this? We were talking a little bit earlier, and you telling me that you go to various conferences and you do talks on various technologies and stuff. Is this something you have been talking about for a while, or do you also discuss other technologies? Because you were telling me you have background in big data and data management and
right. So I talk frequently at conferences on a number of topics. I typically go to conferences like Code One, Collaborate, run by the International Oracle Users Group, other content-specific conferences like Dataversity, which is like a conference for the engineers, the Analytics and Data Summit, Oracle Open World, and so on. So everywhere I tend to try to focus on a little bit of hands-on sessions for developers, not necessarily full hands-on lab, but content that will be exciting to a developer and help them get started, whatever they're working on. And I've been working with I've been speaking about SQL access to Kafka for maybe a year and a half now. Ever since we began planning the product, I began talking about it. And I also talk about some of the other products that I work with, like as you mentioned, the big data products. I also work with graph databases and graph analytics, so I talk about that as well. That's another hot topic, which I think is also being covered at OGYatra. I think one of our friends who's AS director is speaking about graphs sometime next week. So I talk about graphs as well. So I cover a variety of topics. I get really focused on helping developers get started. That's my goal, because I find sometimes that new technology can be intimidating, and when someone throws it to you a 50-page document, when people don't have the time or the patience to read, when there's so many things going on, developers have so many demands on their time.
yeah.
So my goal always is help them get started with the minimum investment in terms of time. They should be able to get at what this technology can do for them very quickly. That's always my goal, either by presenting and telling them how they get started, and also by helping design products that will help them get started.
So it sounds like you enjoy this in terms of interacting with the community, whether it's a customer or developer or DBA, someone outside the company. So you have your development work internally, obviously, and your team work, but going outside seems to be something that you enjoy.
Oh, very much so. I love listening to the business problems that they're trying to solve, and I also love explaining things to people and saying, okay, this is how this works. And I guess a little bit of I've never been a teacher formally, but I guess there's a little bit of the teacher in me. I enjoy explaining difficult concepts, and it's a thrill to me when I'm able to explain something in a way that somebody understands. Great, I did a good job only when somebody could quickly understand it. if I do a 1 hour session and people don't understand me at the end, then I've really failed as a presenter. So I like that. I like that interaction, and it also gives me lots of feedback on how the product is perceived. When people say they like this, then, and it also gives us real insights into what are the real challenges. I mean, sometimes if you just sit in our offices, we tend to think that, oh, this real challenging problem in computer science is what we need to solve next. Whereas a developer will have a very simple problem of, I have this file and I don't know what schema this file has, and how do I take this and load it into a table? How do I figure out, like in the Kafka context, how do I figure out the schema in this Kafka record, and I want to map this to a table? So how do I make that simple? These nuts and bolts things are what to be simplified, I think, for developers to go ahead and solve their business problems and not worry about the nuts and bolts stuff. I think that's what we need to do as software developers, and provide products that so that the developers don't have to worry about that.
Right. It is interesting. Whenever I have a conversation like this with someone like you, I always get very interested, because I'm particularly interested in how developers think, because you're always solving problems. Some people and developers, they talk about it all the time. I do my best thinking in the shower, or
Right.
or while I'm gardening or something, or when I'm highly focused on something for hours at a time. I'm very interested in the thought processes to solve really, really hard problems. Because just some of the things that you've said here are some serious scalability and very, very complex things, and you need a certain way of thinking in order to go very deeply to solve them and to create new opportunities, with the product or with code, right?
Right.
So it's really interesting listening to you talk about it. I can just listen for forever. Okay, so let's see what else here. And actually, you're based in New Hampshire, I see here as well.
Yes, indeed. I am, and we're in the middle of a nice, gorgeous summer, and it's just wonderful. The vivid seasons are wonderful in New Hampshire. I just love the fall, the winter, the spring, the summer, all of them. The market change between them.
Yeah, I used to live in Derry. I used to live in. I used to live in New England for about 10 years, all around Boston and southern New Hampshire. All right. Well, Melly, it was great talking to you. I think I learned a lot, and it was really interesting. And good luck with your session. The Yatra developers are really engaging. It's a really. I've been to India multiple times in the last few years, and whenever I sit in on a session, they're always really, really engaged, and there's some pretty good developers there, and so I'm sure they'll be happy to hear about your stuff.
Thank you very much, Jim. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to an engaged session. I haven't spoken at Yatra before. This is my first time, but I've spoken at Code One and other events, and yes, I do find that developers can be very engaging and ask really tough questions. So we have a conversation and not just a one-way presentation. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, and maybe next year we'll actually be on the tour physically.
Yeah, that would be nice, wouldn't it? I hope so for next year.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Bye-bye.